Hey everyone, this is Will from Charlotte, North Carolina, and welcome to this brand new and important episode of The Missing Piece. Now, if you follow the news closely, more than a month, the tension between Russia and Ukraine right now is escalating on the daily basis. About a month ago, the world, to be more precisely, the Western countries, thought that Vladimir Putin was bluffing the whole time in terms of Ukraine's invasion. However, a month later, fast forward, we don't know exactly when this conflict is going to end, which has already caused massive devastation for people in both countries. You know, you could say that at this moment, more international leaders are trying to distance themselves away from Vladimir Putin, especially the ones who are considered allies or friends. But this time, because of the domestic political shift, they're pulling themselves away. And the leader from the close country of Hungary is doing exactly what I just said. So that's why today that it's so crucial in this episode, I want to talk about the country of Hungary and what Viktor Orban is trying to shape under this tension between Russia and Ukraine. Joining our show today is Dr. Péter Krekó, and Peter is a social psychologist and political scientist. He's the director of Political Capital Institute, a Budapest-based think tank since 2011. He's a regular commentator in the international media and published articles, among others, in Foreign Affairs, Guardian, Newsweek, and other major outlets. So without further ado, Peter, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks a lot, Will, for having me.
No problem. The pleasure's all mine. You know, since the day that I approached your article, and, you know, I was very impressed and amazed by how you explain the country of Hungary, and it's to be more precise, as I mentioned in the intro, the current leader, Viktor Orban, is trying to distance himself away from Putin, and once they were allies or friends with each other. So let's go to the first question, Peter. What kind of country that, according to your research, that Orban is trying to build under this globalization or under the influence of Russia and Ukraine today?
Yeah, thanks again for having me in the show. And just to put it in a bit of a context, I think it's crystal clear for all viewers and listeners, but Hungary is an EU and NATO country that is neighboring Ukraine. And the interesting ambivalence in the Hungarian foreign policy is, on the one hand, Hungary in many sense is keeping the EU and NATO mainstream when it comes to, for example, accepting US soldiers coming to Hungarian soil in the framework of NATO, which has just been approved in the NATO summit. Or there has been more than 3 sanctions round that have been supported by Hungary already against Russian individuals, companies, even the SWIFT system against a few banks. So it was a big package of sanctions so far. On the other hand, we can see that the inertia of the pro-Putin policies that Viktor Orban has been built for more than a decade. So Viktor Orban then, he was in opposition already back to 2008, 2009. He was a very harsh critic of Viktor Orban. And when Georgia invaded, when Russia invaded Georgia, then he told that NATO has to be strong in defending even Georgia, and the next step would be that Georgia and even Ukraine should step into NATO, and then it would prevent Russia from further aggression. So, but he made a very obvious pro-Russian shift when he was in government, partially for economic reasons, for example, for cheap gas that he could sell to his own voters. But also for private reasons. There seems to be some pro-governmental interests are very closely circulating all the businesses with Vladimir Putin's Russia having huge benefits from it. But also there is one more component, and this is ideology. So Viktor Orban deeply believes in the decline of the West and in the rise of some Eastern stars. And already back to 2014, he told that West is on decline and liberal democracies are rather weakening, while at the same time he mentioned a few countries that he thinks can be the promising future models. And he mentioned in this group Russia, China. He also mentioned India. He mentioned Singapore. So it's a diverse set of countries. But I think from these two, Russia and China is the most important. And if we take a look at what kind of policies Orban have followed in the last few years, and answering your question finally, we can see that Orban, for example, made the Hungarian press way more centralized than it was before. And Hungary has the most centralized media system in the European Union, with more than 400 media outlets were put into one huge media conglomerate, and it is directed via political ways and via political logic, and it's a mouthpiece for the Hungarian government. How it began? It began via, for example, buying up independent media outlets by pro-Orban oligarchs, and then these media outlets were turned into governmental mouthpieces. And this is a bit similar to what Vladimir Putin have done after the cursed submarine catastrophe at the early days of his presidency, when he could feel that an independent media can be deadly dangerous for his reputation and image. So that's one example. The other example is the rhetoric about the West in general. So in many sense, Orban is repeating the sound bites. And of course, we can see it in the far right in all over the Western world, including United States as well. But the rhetoric is pretty much what we can hear in Russia. And this is that the decadent liberal West is on the decline. LGBTQ eats it up, immigration eats it up, and the whole Western world is in a moral decay on the one hand, on the other hand in an economic decay, while there are some bastions of Christianity and traditional values, such as Russia, that are showing the way. So this decline of the West narrative is very strong, and also the conspiracy theories that Hungary uses. I mean, Hungarian government got totally obsessed with conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories practically became the official policy on the government. And this shows similarity as well to Vladimir Putin's Russia, where we can see that there is a fortress mentality. Everyone is against us, so we have to defend the country. But of course, Orban is not only learning from Vladimir Putin, and his regime is put together using bits and pieces from many international models. Donald Trump from the United States was also highly inspiring for the Hungarian leaders, but we can see that there is an authoritarian learning cycle in which Hungary is, on the one hand, a pupil, on the other hand, a teacher as well to other countries in Central Eastern Europe. And the direction in which Orban brings the country is obviously authoritarian, but we cannot and should not make a false equation between Russia and Hungary. Russia is an increasingly totalitarian state, and especially since the war began, it turned more authoritarian, while Orban's Hungary is a soft hybrid regime that is not a real well-functioning democracy anymore, but you don't see, for example, this massive violence and, for example, massive imprisonments that you can see in more dictatorial countries.
Peter, it's so interesting that you mentioned the figure of former U.S. President Donald Trump. And let's talk about, the ongoing relationship, especially in this political sense, between the U.S. and Hungary. And if I'm not mistaken, that before Joe Biden was elected, and he was actually questioned as a presidential candidate regarding, his perspective and his view towards the country of Hungary. And, from the major media outlets, that the Democrats specifically was not actually in favor of Viktor Orban. So in other words, that they believe that he was actually the opposite of what democracy should represent, in terms of closing the borders and nationalistic policy and, how to keep this party unified. And so, again, it was rather difficult for the U.S. to figure out the leadership, in Hungary. But meanwhile, Peter, not too long ago, you tweeted on social media, and I quit. You said, Orban's two message in the campaign, peace and cheap energy. And Orban has sensed the security concern of his voter base, and he's seeking to maintain continuity with his pre-war pro-Putin rhetoric, even during these extraordinary circumstances for the world. Let's go back to the first phrase. Orban was actively looking for peace. Peter, what does that mean? Because we know today, again, this person used to see that Putin was the leader, was such an influential figure. But today, he's concerned, or he's greatly concerned about his own election within this party. So what does that mean when you say his campaign message is peace, and how feasible is it for him to maintain peaceful within this own political party?
Yes, so Hungary will have an election in 3rd of April. So it's only 10 days to go until then. And what we see in the polls, and Orban is, of course, before this election, he's very careful of the polls, because he has to win the election. And even if the opposition, even if the electoral system is a bit tricked, but he needs a majority, at least a relative majority, to win the election. So his main campaign rhetoric is twofold. First of all, do not let any countries to pull Hungary into this war of Russia and Ukraine, with some subtle hints, not obvious statements about that. The West played a role in provoking that, and US played a role in provoking that, and NATO had some role in provoking that. But it's more like he says it's in a vague way in his speeches that it's plausibly deniable. But the other message is that if you want cheap energy, and that in the whole Western world there is a huge energy crisis at the moment, with energy prices skyrocketing. If you need cheap energy, then we have to keep good relationship with Russia. Thanks for your question on this peace issue, because we remember it very well here in Central Eastern Europe. In countries that were under the occupation of the Soviet Union, with Soviet troops being here. And in 1956, for example, something similar happened in Hungary, that what now happens in Ukraine. Hungary had stood up for its independence, for its freedom, and wanted a political change, like people in the Maidan did back to 2014. 13-14 in Ukraine, and then Russia invaded and decided the fate of the country via weapons and tanks. And we remember here that what did the peace camp mean? Peace camp was the socialist camp, because the West is of warmongers like NATO and United States, and the Eastern Bloc wants peace. So I have a bit of a bad feeling when I hear some hypocritical peace rhetoric these days. And this is exactly what we can see in Hungary at the moment. Why? Because the argument is that if you want peace, we have to stay out of the conflict in the stance that there is no bilateral weapon transfers to Ukraine. There are no weapons transferred through the territory of Hungary directly to Ukraine. And let's stay out so that we do not become targets. But you know, Poland wants peace as well, but they have a different approach, and I think they have a bit better sense of reality here. If you want to avoid war, then you have to prepare for the worst.
That's right.
And help the one who is fighting the war instead of you, and this is exactly Ukraine at the moment. But for the majority of the Hungarians, and especially the right-wing electorate, that first of all heard a lot of anti-Western rhetoric in the last few years. Second, a lot of anti-Ukrainian rhetoric in the last few years. Third, a lot of pro-Russian rhetoric in the last few years. So their assessment and feeling at the moment is much more, we have to stay out of that because it's not our business. And there is a lot of rhetoric that blames the victim, in this case, like Ukraine. There is a lot of rhetoric that blames the United States. And Orban sees that right now, before the election, if he would have a U-turn, then it would be a political suicide. So he did not have a 180 degrees turn, but let's say just 90%. And he wants to keep these two selling points, peace and cheap gas. But as we could hear just this dawn from Volodymyr Zelensky, who gave a speech to the European Council, that he was highly combatant towards Viktor Orban for his reluctance to support Ukraine in its fight. And even if Hungary did already a lot so far, and it's important to mention, so Viktor Orban's government went a long way, but if the victim, if you want to help the victim, then you have to do help that the victim needs. If you have other interests, of course, just self-defense, then the situation is different. And it seems like the Hungarian government is referring to this wrong national interest, while honestly, I do think that Hungary's national interest would be first to reduce energy independence from Russia. And the Hungarian government did not do so much about it in the last 12 years. Second, to support Ukraine with weapons through the EU, which Hungary is already supporting, but bilaterally as well, because if we do not want to be neighbors with Russia and become the next target of Russian aggression, then the only way for that is to support Ukraine's fight for sovereignty. And even if they fail later, then it means that Russia's appetite for destruction will be a bit lower after the war is over.
Peter, we are living in this reality today that we know on one hand, through the tension or this war between Russia and Ukraine, the current leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, has been elevated in this international image. So in other words, if I can put in a very modest way, that today Zelensky, it's being portrayed as this international hero because he has been very courageous and he has been fighting at the front line with the Ukrainian soldiers. And most importantly, he's sending this message of unification, even despite the circumstances that he was hiding or he was living in the bunker, because of what's going on in the country at this moment. But on the other hand, the world is watching that personality or the characteristics of Vladimir Putin. It's astonishing to the world. But one thing, Peter, we have to understand right now, probably it's a critical moment for a lot more international leaders to think about which line should I stand behind. But again, going back to Orban, let's say, intentionally to pulling himself away from Russia. I mean, don't you think that one day, I mean, again, we hope that day won't come, but one day when Vladimir Putin is regaining his position, is regaining his power, continue to influence the world, that could actually bring a lot more negativity or even vulnerability to the leader in Hungary. Don't you think that he's placing himself on this wrong path? Or you think that he's finally able to distance himself away from this person because Vladimir Putin eventually loses or eventually will lose his space within this international community?
Which Hungarian government would see this as you see, in the sense that, yes, I do think that what the Hungarian government does, referring to national interests continuously, goes directly against Hungarian national interests. And what this balancing game at the moment is impossible to keep. Why? You cannot satisfy Russia, because in a sanctions regime, then you technically cannot increase the trade relations. Not to talk about the political relations. What can you do to or why are you investing still in this relationship? Just if, and it's like totally speculative, if you are afraid of some kind of negative consequences, that if you turn against Vladimir Putin, then you will face some kind of punishment. It might be some fear in the head of Viktor Orban, but we don't know it for sure. And so you cannot satisfy Russia. On the other hand, you cannot satisfy the West either, because, as you said, Volodymyr Zelensky have become a hero. Right now, that his criticism against Viktor Orban became, bipersonal and bilateral. In the Western world, is putting all their, let's say, is attributing a lot of credibility to Volodymyr Zelensky. So Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukraine in this conflict can undermine Hungary's reputation even more than Viktor Orban did beforehand. So I don't think Orban picks the good fight, and he can win it so easily. And despite the fact that Hungary is reluctantly following most of the sanction decisions so far, but the reputation of the country is more and more horrible, in the sense that it is perceived in many countries as a traitor of the Western Bloc and Western world and NATO. And I think it's a bit of unjust, because Hungary have, as I said, already done a lot, but Viktor Orban is clearly the most dovish politician in the European Union, and right now in the NATO as well. While it's a tough competition, you have countries like Cyprus, you have countries like Greece, you have countries like Germany in the European Union, and still this loud reluctance to support Ukraine and the loud reluctance to condemn Vladimir Putin's Russia, so loud that even you can hear it in Moscow. And in Moscow, the news outlets, you can see that Hungary is still somehow mentioned as, a good outlier in the Western Bloc. So you can continue to do that, but at the end of the day, I think it will result in total isolation, and this is what Hungary is heading towards. And if Viktor Orban wins one more term in the elections that are coming, according to the polls, he has a higher chance to win the elections than the opposition. If he wins one more term, what will he do? He just cannot maintain his path. And what he started to reference already is that the new world order will be defined by China. So maybe his pro-Russian policies will go down the drain, but his obsession towards an other authoritarian model, China, will not decline as a result, and especially if China does not enter into the war via providing Russia weapons. And my bet would be that they won't, because it's against their interest. So then it might be even a possibility that having some kind of relationship with China will be, a bit more accepted in the Western world than it has been before the war. And this new era, Orban can turn to another authoritarian model and copy-paste some policies that China uses, not the economic policy, of course, but, some of the authoritarian line that Xi Jinping is already following.
Peter, I'm very glad that you mentioned the country of China. And let's talk about the role of China. Lately, since I believe we could trace way back to a week ago or even 2 weeks ago, China came out a statement that during the press conference to the international community many times, and regardless however you question, the administration of foreign affairs, to place the position on the tension or the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, China has always maintained this neutral and this positive attitude, and to say China has never been or will never show any interest in meddling any international conflict, because China believes that peace negotiation or peaceful compromise should be the priority at this moment. So in other words, that even though China, has not shown any support or nor condemnation towards Russia, but I think clearly we can read between the messages. But meanwhile, Peter, Joe Biden, it's on this tour with the NATO summit recently, and he's trying really hard to rally his allies to place more sanctions and to join this effort to stop Vladimir Putin from moving forward economically or politically. But China, as the one major player in the world today, seem to be, again, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, could be a political obstacle for a lot more countries to continue pressure Russia. So the question to you is, what do you think, or how do you think that U.S. is going to overcome the barriers or overcome this hurdle without hurting or damaging the relationship between U.S. and China in order to make the message more effective to the NATO allies, in order to stop or in order to curb this widely spread of Putinism?
Yeah, so China's role is very interesting here, and yes, on the one hand, if you open Global Times, the nationalist hardliner voice of the Chinese Communist Party, you can see a lot of supportive articles towards Russia, condemnation of the West, and so on. I think China is interested in that Russia wins the war, but through a very high costs that is weakening Russia, and it becomes crystal clear for everyone in the world that the next world order, as Viktor Orban said, will be defined by China and the United States. So I think China is interested in this kind of more bipolar antagonism. I think they would be happy if Russia could win it without their support. And yes, there were some intel in the US and even in the EU that hinted at that China might support Russia with weapons. I think these were just more of an empty promise from the Chinese side. And because, here, and I think everyone that does business with China know that it's 90% promise, usually maximum 10% substance. And so I think these are rather empty promises. I do think that China is watching carefully about A, what will be the consequence, B, how strongly the Russian economy will be hit by the sanctions. And I think they will learn the lesson. The big difference between China and Russia is that China feels that it's a growing empire with an increasing strength. So it's like, only 3 decades ago, the economy of China and Russia was about the same size. And, right now China has about 30 times as big economy as Russia does.
That's right.
And the Chinese foreign policy and economic policy and geopolitics is way more strategic than Russia. Russia feels that it's a declining empire. It's a declining ex-empire that has to show strength to gain back its recognition and prestige. And that's for that reason, I think China plays rather a long-term game. So far, I do not see signs of that China would change or work on changing the attitudes of any countries relating to the Russian conflict. I think what will change the attitude, though, is the prolongation and the endurance of the Russian war against Ukraine, because there is such thing as a war fatigue. And I think anyone who lives in the United States knows that when a war starts, there is a huge attention. Everyone is looking at the news. Everyone is curious. Everyone is debating that. But people just fed up after a while of seeing the murder of civilians, of seeing the endurance of the war, and then it just goes off the top of the agenda. And I think when this issue becomes the new normal, however horrible it is, or horrible addictive, if Russia wins the war, then there will be some, voices who say that, okay, we will have to go back to normal with Russia. Like there were these voices after the Russian war against Georgia and against the annexation of Crimea. I think it will be much more difficult then, but I'm pretty sure that politicians such as Viktor Orban, if he remains in power, he will be among the first voices who will argue for elevating the sanctions.
Peter, I know you're very busy, and I do really appreciate your time. I got 2 more questions before letting you go. Let's go back to the article that you wrote. When we talk about this agenda for Viktor Orban, and this is what you wrote, and I quote, Orban is mostly swimming with the EU and NATO tide on sanctions, and he is doing so reluctantly. This reluctance can be traced to 3 main causes, and one of the causes that you laid out clearly is what we called ideological. And this is what you wrote, Peter. You said, although he justified building up his close relationship with Russia, citing national interest and ideological proximity between Orban's Hungary and Putin's Russia has become more and more apparent. So to me, Peter, again, Viktor Orban, it's so passionate about this country, and he's looking for ways to reshape his ideology, not only for this domestic audience, but also for these international players. So my next question to you is, for this upcoming election, or let's just say hypothetically, if he's elected, how do you think that he's going to continue shape his ideology for the country of Hungary, and or even this in a greater scale, that putting his brand new this episode or brand new this marketing strategy out there in order to let people to understand that Viktor Orban, it's someone that he's putting out his brand new image in terms of ideological stand?
Yeah, so I'm rather optimistic in the sense, like Francis Fukuyama is, that this war against Ukraine will finally, will finally lead to a stronger West. The West has already shows way higher unity than it was expected, not the least by Vladimir Putin himself. Vladimir Putin for months were negotiating bilaterally by world leaders, and his impression was that the West is really divided, so we can go and attack. And it was a total miscalculation. and he underestimated the strength of EU and NATO, I do think. And so for that reason, I think he strongly miscalculated. The West is already united than it has been. And, if you take a look at the debate in countries like Germany, they say that, this pragmatic relationship with dictators simply doesn't work, and we have to learn the lesson. And they say we have to learn the lesson with Turkey, with China, and others as well. Of course, it's like pragmatism and this transactional foreign policy will not disappear from the Western world immediately. But still, I think the long-term impact can be much more cautiousness towards the totalitarian and dictatorial regimes, and also with a less appeal of these regimes in the Western world. Vladimir Putin was a hero for many. He stopped to be a hero for many, and the ones for whom he was a hero, like Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Far Right, they are strongly humiliated now in the Western world. So for that reason, I think Orban's big illiberal dream and adventures, he was hoping for, a new authoritarian world order in which Europe as well will see a different kind of leadership than before. And I think these hopes will evaporate. And of course, he will not do a U-turn. I think democratic backsliding and the authoritarian way is a one-way road. So you can't go back and re-democratize after you yourself weaken the institutions. But if you stays in power, which is not sure at the moment, I think his regime will rather keep the current level of oppression and authoritarianism without the real possibility of go forward, because the authoritarian models will be less attractive, and also he desperately needs the EU money. And if he goes forward in the undemocratic path, then EU money will be frozen, and it means that his regime can be more and more popular after getting re-elected, because they have to do authoritarian measures as well.
Peter, I want to end our conversation with one major important aspect that we all talk about today, especially post the pandemic. It doesn't matter if you're living in this country, in this capitalistic system, or authoritarianism or socialism. However, one of the buzzwords that people care the most is about the word economy. So in other words, economic sustainability. So I want to end this conversation, Peter, regarding this current economic system or current economic situation in Hungary. So from your perspective, again, in 10 days, Viktor Orban is going to join this fight, or he has already joined this political election. From your standpoint, Peter, how do you describe this current economic system in Hungary today, and what will be the changes under Viktor Orban, especially during this new administration or under this current election season?
Orban have already, I would say, is a state capitalist and in that respect, I think, this regime, I would not say that shows similarity to China, but I think he even understands China more as a state capitalist model, and state capitalism in the sense that on the one hand he knows that a well-running economy is a must. Also, if you have some private interests in a well-running economy as well, and the governmental side, economic expansion is huge. So if you want yourself and your cronies to earn a lot of money, then it also means that you are interested in a well-running economy. And on the other hand, etatist and state capitalists, because we can see that the state is clearly having a bigger influence on, for example, setting the rules in occupying sectors, in selectively helping market players, and it really goes against the core values of free market. So it's a highly ambivalent regime, but so far it was operating well, and Orban went against a lot of, let's say, traditional economic rules and axioms, and he defined his own policy as unorthodox, so it goes against the orthodoxies of the free market, classical liberal economy, and still it could be successful. I think, on the other hand, it will be more and more difficult in the next period, where with most likely, also because of the sanctions, rather declining economic period coming. So we will see, if he remains in power, that how can we and via what tools manage through an economic crisis that we haven't really experienced so far. And my bet would be that even he's a capitalist, he will know that selectively putting, as he already did, taxes on multinational companies that are unable to go away and will keep their assets into the country, this is the best way of plugging holes in the budget, while also keeping the voter base happy.
Well, as the whole world continues to follow the escalation between Russia and Ukraine, of course, on one hand, we hope and I pray that this conflict is not going to draw too much, because again, as I mentioned before, people in both countries are getting to the tipping point that war would never be the solution to any political problems. But also, on the other hand, it's a good reminder for international leaders to actually sit down peacefully and, cross our fingers in terms of seeking the differences and in terms of, building compromise in a greater way. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Péter Krekó, and he's a social psychologist and political scientist, and he's the director of Political Capital Institute, a Budapest-based think tank since 2011. Péter, thank you so much for taking your time to be on my show, and we appreciate your insights and your analysis. Most importantly, that your well-written article published in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, etc. Again, Péter, thank you so much for doing this, and we'd love to have you back on the show again for the future topic regarding the crisis or the good news with